Red Hat OpenShift is the sponsor for our container platform coverage from OSCON in Austin, Texas. OpenShift reaches across open source communities to collaborate for healthy upstream development. The goal? Ensure the support for features and functionalities that end users require across the overall ecosystem. You can learn more at openshift.com. Hey, it's Alex Williams of the New Stack here at OSCON in Austin, Texas for the first recording of the Container Platform Day we are doing here. And I'm lucky to have with me Diane Mueller, Director of Community Development at Red Hat. And Diane, I've known you for a while, and I was just saying how nice it is to have you here and see you and just see how much you have, how far you have come in this community and helping build it. So thanks for joining us.
Yes, well, thank you. It's wonderful to be here. It's wonderful to be back at OSCON, Beyond the New Stack, and here for Open Container Day. And it's just a wonderful opportunity to get to chat with you again.
So we're talking about bringing community back to the people, and you presented this at Ignite. This, I can tell, is something that you really believe passionately about. Can you tell us about what this story is that you're telling and what its roots are? And
Sure. I've been doing, most people know me as a community person. I've been working in open source for probably over 20 years in different pieces and parts of it. And I've watched the evolution of open source community models happen and evolve and take on new features and approaches to working with community. And at Red Hat, I've had the great pleasure of being the community manager for OpenShift, which is what was formerly known as a platform as a service, now renamed as a container platform, which is why we're here at Container Day. And because of where this project lands in the cloud stack, you have the infrastructure underneath us, so we have to work with the OpenStack community, the AWS community, the Google Compute community, all the different Linuxes communities, RHEL, Fedora, CentOS. So as a community manager, I have to engage at that level. As a platform as a service, we had a whole metaphor for cartridges and gears, and so we had all of these service providers creating cartridges and gears, which are now what we call containers. Right, yeah. So we had everybody from MongoDB to the Python community and Node.js. So we had to work with all of those folks, and we actually upstream now many projects into OpenShift. So Kubernetes is a dear and close upstream partner with us, as is Docker and Ansible. We recently rewrote all of OpenShift in Go, so we moved from being Ruby lovers to Go lovers. And so that sets up a very different dynamic for community. And so what we did with OpenShift, and what I'm working on now, and when I talk about bringing community back, is that having a community approach that's really focused on code contributors only, trying to get people to work on your project, no longer works because there's so many upstream projects, there's so many people across the stratas. So what we're trying to do is build something that we call the OpenShift Commons, or create a new metaphor for what people think of as open source community models. And most of us remember, or everybody in the open source community probably has read Eric Raymond's book, The Cathedral and Bazaar, the accidental musings of a Linux developer and how he brought in this wonderful metaphor, and it really did inform us, and the cathedrals being where the proprietary software was being built out. And the bazaar is where we all got together, and there was a wonderful, in theory, meritocracy about anybody could have a booth in the bazaar, like at a farmer's market. And that metaphor worked for a time. And if you remember, Eric's book came out in 1999, right? We've come a long way since then. And so for us in the commons world that we're creating at OpenShift, that metaphor no longer worked. So what we see are now foundations becoming the new cathedrals. So wherein before Eric's wonderful metaphor with cathedrals were being like Sun and Oracle, and this is why you set off your sound on your phone. The metaphor is broken of the cathedrals, as is the metaphor of the bazaar, because the bazaar now is probably better called a marketplace. Every every cloud has a marketplace, every vendor has, is in these marketplaces, but it's not individuals any longer, because the individuals don't really have a voice in a foundation-driven world. The foundations have a role. I'm not saying they should go away.
But foundations are increasingly more common now, and we have the Linux Foundation running multiple foundations. I mean, it's like, the Linux Foundation serves as an organization to manage the foundation.
It's a machine in it. I love, I'm working now with the CNCF, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, and it's an amazing thing. And foundations are great for incubating projects. Right, and giving governance and guidance to projects and helping find resources for individual projects and, making sure that they live and breathe. And so there is a role for foundations. I'm not saying they should go away. And the Linux Foundation is brilliant in creating events and manage events and getting the word out about them. What I'm talking about here is a different thing. It's a thing about how do we get more communication across all of those projects. If you were here a couple of weeks ago for the OpenStack Summit, there were, here in Austin,
yes,
there was over 7,000 attendees at that. And there were, I don't know how many projects now are being incubated under that wonderful big tent metaphor that OpenStack has. But what you did see was not a lot of cross-pollination. The Neutron and the Nova folks and those things, they're working on their project. And sometimes there's a little cross-pollination. And then there's a whole crowd of the 7,000. We're all wonderful newbies who are coming too.
Doesn't this speak to the larger challenge that we're now facing because of, you think of terms like microservices, which is really, a symbol of what you're talking about, isn't it? Because now we're talking about lots of components working together as a service.
Yeah. So I think the interesting thing about that is those new models require new models of open source communities too. And that's really what we're trying to do, is create more peer-to-peer conversations, have a level playing field where there's no CLAs, there's no foundation fees to join, that it's within the OpenShift Commons, at least, which is the first use of Commons outside of you might have heard it through Wiki Commons or Flickr Commons, or the Parliament in the UK has a Commons, and I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about more like the Boston Commons, where there's a shared level playing field for everybody to join, and to be able to reach across and talk to someone from another aspect of the ecosystem without a barrier, and to be able to facilitate that. And we need new tools, the world of Slack and virtual tools and connectivity. So we're trying to apply those metaphors as well and break down the barriers, barriers to entry, barriers to connecting, and create a new world in which open source communities can have vibrant conversations where there can be lots of diversity of conversations, diversity of use cases, and what we're developing are, through these conversations, is a whole series of best practices on everything ranging from operations to how to build a reusable, redistributable image, because in the world of Docker, there needs to be some best practices around security for those images themselves. So it's a way to facilitate those conversations without, for example, without Red Hat getting in the way, without Red Hat being the mediator of all those conversations, just the facilitator of them instead.
So now we see the emergence of GitHub, right? And we see the emergence of GitHub as a place for open source communities to develop. And but those are still very kind of singular and silo oriented. So what is the next generation going to look like if it's not epitomizing
Slack and had a baby? What would that look like?
All right, there's our headline. If GitHub met Slack and had a baby.
What would that look like? Because GitHub is great because it allows us a place to host our code, to describe our code in README files, to create wiki pages so we can have landing pages, and to push issues and make pull requests and merges. So there's, at the code level, there's a lot of conversation. The community isn't just about code contribution. It's about understanding the use cases, getting the feedback, having conversations which people riff off of each other and go, wow, I never would have thought of that as a way to go down that pike in terms of the use of this new, framework that someone wrote in, Node or something like that. So there's Git is great. Slack, on the other hand, is this place where you can open up amazing conversations, where anyone can come into a conversation without a barrier. There's some security and privacy stuff. One of the things about Commons that we really try to strive hard is, in a world that's so obsessed with privacy, I'm asking people to self-identify. So in GitHub, there's a lot of people who have really strange little names. Like my Twitter handle is Python DJ. You probably never, if you didn't meet me in person and you never heard me speak, you wouldn't know that I was a woman, right? Mm-hmm. Or that I worked for Red Hat, because on my page, I don't think in my GitHub page I don't identify as a Red Hat employee.
Right.
So my agenda, which is definitely influenced by my employer.
Definitely.
So not as much as they probably would like it to be, but I think having people self-identify as, yes, I am with Docker, yes, I am with Oracle, yes, I am with this, as opposed to using their Gmail account, I think that gives us a little more accountability for the agendas we bring with us. But it also needs to be a space where people who are not associated with a vendor can come in and be part of.
So we've talked about this quite a bit at the News Stack, and how we think about the overall ecosystem. And I've come to think of it almost as what I call the Galaxy Project. And I call it the Galaxy Project because what seems like what we're seeing here is with open source, we're seeing that no one company actually does it all, right?
Not anymore.
And that's what, that seems like you're embodying in the Commons principle, but it's actually multiple companies working together, and they actually, this needs to happen organically, almost in its own way.
And it's not just about the companies. It's about the open source project leaders participating, individuals who are users or hosts and operators. So with OpenShift, we have dozens of people who have stood up public pauses, like Get Up Cloud down in Brazil, and a couple of folks in Cloud Isle in Germany, and a number of managed hosting providers who are using OpenShift, and they have a different perspective on it than, say, the OpenShift Online gang that are in-house hosted version or OpenShift dedicated. So they all there's a whole group that have this special interest in common around how to operate, monitor at a huge scale. That's much different than an enterprise operator.
Right.
So how do you cross all of that and create a special interest group for that?
So that creates like a dynamic there, right, with a Commons environment, right? And you focus on the technical dynamics, but I'm curious about the market dynamics too.
Well, that's that's the other interesting piece of this puzzle too. Is that right now there's there's 210 organizations, and I say organizations specifically not to say companies. Some of them are open source projects. Some of them are vendors who are selling services that embed into and can be used by developers on OpenShift, like Crunchy Data's Postgres offerings. There's all kinds of people in this ecosystem talking to each other. So there is and I'll say a couple weeks ago we did a wonderful Commons briefing with the Crunchy Data folks, and they are a great example of the kind of conversation that we like to have in the Commons. Here they took Postgres, they containerized it, but they didn't just containerize it, they containerized the entire tool chain, so using Prometheus and the PG data, a lot of the tools for Postgres in other containers. And what they did was they created a great generic template for anyone who has a data store that wants to containerize it. And they didn't come on and give a punch for, a shout out for how wonderful CrunchyDB is, or even how wonderful Postgres is. What they came on in was telling people how a best practice for containerizing things and for making data stores work in a containerized Kubernetes-based world. So those are the kind of conversations that were, and in exchange, people love them, right? People now will think of them as, okay, Postgres is available to run. So there's a bit of a quid pro quo, but what we're trying to do is facilitate those conversations that are exchanges of best practices as opposed to product marketing dumps.
So let's, so we don't have that much more time, so I just want to conclude things kind of with summing up what we're talking about, but adding one element here, and that's about the changing stack, right? The new stack, so to speak, right? And one of the things is about containers is they're as symbolic for developers as they are for people in operations,
yep.
right? So they have, so people, across the entire application development and management lifecycle are thinking about containers, right? And so when people are, so now we have this new influence, right? How is that going to affect this need for this GitHub's Slack kind of platform? Because what we're seeing really is the need for more integrated tool environments. Yep. Because developers are continuing to consume the infrastructure, yep. right? And the operations people are starting to think through how they're using containers. But there's all kinds of different issues here. There's identity issues, right?
Yep.
Like, who am I? Am I a network administrator or am I a developer, right? What are the constructs, right? Are we talking about IP or dynamic IP? So there's all these different elements. How that to me seems like such a kind of an uplift of kind of chaos. How do you create that with Commons?
It's a wonderful time to be in this chaotic world.
Yeah.
Because I think we're not quite to Malcolm Gladwell's tipping point moment yet.
Right.
We haven't tipped yet. But tool chains is a really big thing for us.
Right.
And I think as well at the OpenStack Summit, they talked about what is going to be the new LAMP stack. And in my humble opinion, it's something that addresses a lot of those issues in a thorough way. And I would say right now, from my perspective, and it is a very OpenShifty one, is that it's OpenShift Kubernetes on OpenStack is going to be the OKO.
Stackernetes?
The Stackernetes is going to be managing the tool chain for creating images, and there's a whole approach. We have an image SIG, image builder SIG on OpenShift Commons. So if you go to commons.openshift.org, you'll find a whole list of special interest groups. But the image builders are talking about how to use a tool chain that is it's open source one called source to image. So how do you go from your Git source code and build what's now a layered image? So you pick your base OS as a base image, whether it's CentOS, Fedora, Ubuntu, who cares, RHEL even, if you want to pay us, we love you, Atomic Host, what you pick your base image, and then you take some templates and a whole new approach to building those images so that you create an image that's reusable, redistributable, and maintainable. So if you have to patch at the OS level, you can. So there's a whole lot of best practices that are now emerging, and that's what one of the key takeaways from the Commons is trying to capture those best practices. And right now what we do mostly is we talk a lot. Mm-hmm. And if you know me, I talk a lot.
Right.
So every week I do an OpenShift Commons briefing. It's a video thing. We bring in somebody from the community. We talk about a specific topic, and we share best practices like the CrunchyDB one. Last week Google was on, and they talked about the present 1.2 release of Kubernetes and what's coming ahead with 1.3, and Clayton Coleman came on. So there's a whole lot of information sharing, but it's going to be interesting to see how we capture that, like documenting it in wikis, documenting it so that the tribal knowledge in the Commons gets captured and is reusable. And I think that's my next challenge, is taking all of those conversations, working with the community to get those documented and shared in a real way. And and I think that's where GitHub meets Slack meets some other tool that helps me document all the talking. And I haven't seen that yet.
Well, we'll get there.
I'm hoping.
So, Diane, thank you very much for taking some time to talk. Enjoyed the conversation as usual. Great to see you, and we look forward to the rest of the day here at OSCON.
Right, and I'm just going to go off and join the rest of the crew at the Open Container Day here at OSCON.
Great. All right, thanks a lot. Red Hat OpenShift is the sponsor for our container platform coverage from OSCON in Austin, Texas. OpenShift reaches across open source communities to collaborate for healthy upstream development. The goal? Ensure the support for features and functionalities that end users require across the overall ecosystem. You can learn more at openshift.com.